Order, order. We start with questions to the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Neale Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the UK Government implemented...
Question one.
Sorry.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to maintaining high animal welfare and food standards, and since leaving the EU, we have put in place strong controls on imports. And we are using Brexit freedoms to strengthen animal welfare standards even further by banning the export of live animals for slaughter.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Say to the member, we're in the middle of a question. You just walk right in front of it. Neale Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the UK Government implemented a border target operating model where a veterinarian must provide a health certificate for meat imports from the EU. Meanwhile, the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect 6 months ago, is likely to lead to increased imports of low-cost products produced using pesticides in Australia that are not permitted in the UK and in the absence of veterinary checks. According to the RSPCA, Australia's lower animal welfare standards in many sectors such as eggs, pig meat production and chicken. Does the Minister or the Secretary of State accept that this asymmetry on standards of animal welfare is incoherent and poses a significant risk of contaminating the food chain with banned pesticides?
Well, the honourable gentleman mixes two issues. First, he mentions Australia, and specifically he mentioned eggs. If he actually looked at the agreement with Australia, he'll see that eggs are excluded because pork, poultry and eggs were excluded from our agreement with Australia. He also sort of mixed that with the issue of food standards in terms of imports from Europe. And of course, if we did what his party would advocate and were still in the EU, there'd be no checks at all.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, Ian Perks, a constituent of mine, had his entire shipment seized in France for missing a single word on the export health certificate by overzealous French officials. Can the Secretary of State please reassure me that we are going to find arbitration methods to actually speed up the process to challenge these completely ridiculous situations?
Well, I know my honourable friend champions very strongly the farming and food sector within his constituency, and I know he has raised this issue with my right honourable friend, the farming minister, who is actively engaged in it. And of course, a proportionate approach should always be taken on these issues.
Very sure.
Number two.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Powers in the Agricultural Act 2020 allow us to introduce statutory codes of practice to improve market transparency and ensure fairness in the supply chain. And we'll use these powers whenever we find clear evidence of unfair practices so that all farmers get a fair price for their products.
Very Sheerman.
When will the Minister wake up to the fact that since Brexit, food prices have rocketed? My constituents can't afford to buy staple food. Isn't it the truth that farmers are struggling? They are getting almost nothing for their milk, their potatoes, the ordinary things that men and women buy in this country. Where are these higher prices going? Because it's not to the farmers.
Well, I can tell, Honourable Gentleman, where the higher prices are. They're actually in France and Germany. So if you look at the value of a basket of goods, in the UK they're actually lower than they are in the European Union. If we'd followed his model and his advice, we'd still be in the EU. But our retailers, our farmers and our processors are working together. We want to see fairness in that supply chain, and we want to see fairness for the consumer, also for the farmer, for the retailer and the processor.
Virginia Crosbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unsworn farmers, the farming community, are important to food production and their profits are vital to our Anglesey Island economy. Does the Minister agree with Aled Jones, the President of NFU Cymru, that Welsh Government's sustainable farming schemes with damaging consequences and the potential loss of 5,500 jobs in the sector?
Well, I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady in how she campaigns on behalf of her constituents. I know that Welsh farmers are very concerned about the Welsh Government's approach to Welsh agriculture. I know that here in England we're trying to support those farmers to produce top quality food and look after the environment, and I think the Welsh Government need to reflect on how they are influencing their farmers to do exactly the same.
John Warren.
Number three, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to group questions 3 and 5. I know what a blight, litter and fly tipping can have on local communities, which is why we have provided nearly £1 million to help councils purchase new bins and almost £1.2 million to combat fly tipping, and a further £1 million will be awarded in the spring. And we have more than doubled the maximum fines that councils can issue, with all income from fly tipping fines to be reinvested in enforcement and cleaning up our streets from April, to ensure that councils can invest in cracking down on crime.
The Womble's back. John Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents' anger and frustration with litter and fly tipping has grown as £390 million worth of government cuts to Newcastle City Council's budget has impacted services. Children in particular complain to me about having to play in rubbish. So my 15-point plan for rubbish sets out some of the additional powers that councils need to help address the scourge. Will he meet with me to discuss it? And will he back Labour's plan for fixed penalty notices for fly tippers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this government is taking tough action when it comes to dealing with fly tipping, which is why we have specifically ring-fenced the ability for councils to collect and prosecute and ring-fence those fines going back into cleaning up streets. It's important to note, Mr. Speaker, that it is the Conservative councils that are going above and beyond in dealing with this, and it's Labour councils that are 3 times worse compared to Conservative councils in dealing with fly-tipping crime.
Residents living in Cobham Road, Friar Park, in my constituency, have recently experienced fly tipping in the alleyway behind their properties. Despite this being reported by councillors 4 months ago, Sandwell Council has still not removed that rubbish. So apart from telling my constituents to vote Conservative in May, what further steps can the Minister take to ensure councils fulfil their duty to remove rubbish quickly? Because my constituents in West Bromwich East deserve better.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm disappointed to hear once again about fly tipping, the fly tipping that your constituents are experiencing for the first time in Friar Park. And we are giving councils extra powers to crack down on fly tipping, but of course it is up to the council to utilise the powers that we are giving them. And it's important to note that Sandwell Borough Council's Labour administration are once again the worst performing council in the country, with 0 prosecutions for fly tipping last year. And this is despite this Conservative government raising fixed penalty notices from £400 to £1,000, and the government enabling those councils.
Mr. Speaker, Hounslow Borough is plagued with fly tipping, despite the council using all powers it can to address the problem, and large amounts of money to do so, and a good rate of recycling. So, this fly tipping still continues. So, what's the government's timetable for responding to the Public Accounts Committee on their report on the government's programme for waste reforms?
Minister.
Well, we are giving councils more powers than we've ever done before to deal with fly tipping. We have raised the minimum penalty fine from £400 to £1,000, and also ring-fencing the ability for the council to reinvest that money in prosecutions and cleaning up their streets. It's disappointing to see from the stats that Labour councils are not utilising those powers that we are giving them as much as they should do.
Sir Desmond Sway.
The penalties are insufficient. If offenders were garrotted with their own intestines, there'd be fewer of them.
It's important, Mr. Speaker, that councils have the ability to utilise the increased penalty fines that we are giving them to £1,000, and we want, as a government, to see those penalties being utilised so that we can drive down fly tipping in all council areas.
Some law to it.
Number 4, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This government is absolutely clear about the need to end the use of peat products in horticulture in England, and actually the use of peat has halved since 2020, since we signalled this, and in August 2022 we announced that we would ban the sale of peat for use in amateur gardening, and we remain committed to this plan to legislate when parliamentary time allows, and in the meantime we are continuing to work with industry to explore ways to help them transition completely away and go to peat-free working.
Mr. Speaker, UK peatlands store over 3 billion tonnes of carbon, which is more than all the forests in the UK, France and Germany combined. So the government was right to bring in proposals for a ban, but that was back in 2022. and we have no primary legislation yet. And the RHS, which is committed to 100% peat-free itself, says that 40% of industry is awaiting for these legislative proposals to get on with a ban across the whole sector. If they want to do it, they need the legislation, and they need it urgently.
I thank him for that, and I too have met with the RHS. I've been to see their wonderful experiments on peat-free products just very recently, some of which DEFRA put money into. And this government is absolutely committed to ending that use of horticultural peat in horticulture in England, but we will legislate as soon as parliamentary time allows. But in the meantime, we are working, I can assure him, closely with those who want the peat-free mediums, but also the businesses supplying those growing mediums. And there's a wide variety of work going on, research and experiments. And actually, as I said, peat use has halved. And I would also like, he might be interested to know, that the Forestry Commission promises to go peat-free.
Thank the Minister for that very long response. Can I just say, Mr.
Make it carry on, come on.
Peatlands in Northern Ireland are extremely important. They absorb the water and the moisture. They then turn that into a better habitat. The importance of this question here in this House today is equally important to us in Northern Ireland. With the Northern Ireland Assembly hopefully up and running again, will the Minister have discussions with the DEFRA, the DERA Minister there, to ensure we can work together with them for the betterment of all? Thank you.
I thank him for that, and of course it's very important. It is such an important habitat that we work together. That's why we're putting huge amounts of money on restoring peatland in the uplands and the lowlands, and we've just increased our SFI payments for just that, so that farmers can get over £900 a hectare to start to re-wet peat.
Shadow Minister Toby Perkins.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I agree entirely with what the honourable gentleman from East Worthing said. We welcome what the government's intentions are in this regard, but the idea that this government, after 14 years, is so fizzing with new ideas that it just hasn't quite got the parliamentary time to get on with this is candidly laughable. So, will the Minister tell us what is actually happening? We were expecting this in this year's King's speech. It isn't there. There is an urgent need. It is supported by industry. Will the government just get on with implementing one of the very few popular policies they actually have left?
Very good. I think he should also look at what we are doing on peatland. I have just mentioned it. All the work to restore peatlands, upland and lowland, all the work on pilot projects so that farmers can transition to new crops to grow on peatland, and we have committed to banning the use of peat when parliamentary time allows.
Dr. Neale Hudson.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
We have taken quick and decisive action following the concerning rise in fatalities, 9 recent fatalities, and we have now seen 30,000 dog owners registered as part of the balanced approach that we're taking.
Dr. Neale Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the ban on XL bully dogs, owners will now have applied to keep their dogs with a certificate of exemption, and part of that means the dog has to be neutered. The British Veterinary Association has put forward a prudent neutering suggestion, given the evidence that neutering large breed dogs before the age of 18 months can increase the risk of developmental orthopaedic disorders and other medical conditions. Can the government therefore take the reasonable and small step of extending the neutering deadline to the end of June 2025 for those dogs that are under 7 months of age at 31st of January 2024?
Well, given my honourable friend's expertise in this issue as Parliament's only vet, I listen very closely to what he proposes. Of course, as he knows, neutering is a necessary population control, and we have already taken action responding to the greater risks of dogs at a young age by extending the deadline. But I'm very happy to take away the proposal that he raises and look at that again.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The deadline for registering XL bully type dogs was 12 o'clock yesterday. I've been contacted by a constituent of mine who missed the deadline because of financial reasons, because of personal health reasons as well. There'll be many people up and down the country that haven't genuinely been able to meet that deadline. That means, according to the legislation, they could face up to 14 years in prison and an unlimited fine and the destruction of that XL bully pet. Can the Secretary of State advise me what steps people in this position, people who genuinely wanted to register, can you advise what steps they might take to remedy this awful position?
Well, I think across the House, all of us want to ensure that a proportionate approach is taken, that the people register as quickly as possible. We all see the risks in terms of the harm and the attacks, which is, again, something that the House has been united on addressing. So very happy to look at any specific constituency case he raises, but the clear message is people need to register as quickly as possible.
Julie Harrison.
Question number 7, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This year we're increasing payment rates in environmental land management schemes, an average of 10% uplift, and adding around 50 new actions so farmers can access the most comprehensive offer yet. The Sustainable Farming Incentive and Countryside Stewardship mid-tier application process will be streamlined, making it easier for schemes to slot into farm businesses.
Julie Harris.
Thank you. Can I thank my right honourable friend, the Farming Minister, for meeting with my farmers in Wasdale last year. I'm sure the journey through the English Lake District was inspiration to provide those payments for stone walls. I've continued the conversation with a succession of farming policy information suppers. There is a keen desire to take advantage of elms. What farmers are overwhelmingly asking for, though, is clarity about what to go for, when to go for it, to achieve the most successful, sustainable and profitable farm business.
Well, my honourable friend is truly privileged to represent such a beautiful part of England. We are collaborating with stakeholders to make sure our schemes work for them. We regularly communicate through Deferous Farming blog, through meeting them at trade shows, through ministerial visits, and of course through our stakeholders like the NFU, CLA and TFA. We're also providing free business support for farmers and land managers in England through the Future Farming Resilience Fund. Grants and schemes are published to farmers through our single funding page.
Shadow Minister Daniel Zeitner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, last week's report from the government's environmental watchdog, the Office for Environmental Protection, was a damning indictment of the government's record. Largely off track, they said. Just 4 of the 40 targets being achieved. Yeah. So when it comes to the environmental land management schemes, can the Minister tell the House just how much environmental improvement they've helped farmers deliver so far?
Minister.
Well, I think 2 months into a 25-year plan is probably too soon to judge that plan. But what I would say is we're making huge strides with our stakeholders and farmers. They're working up and down the country to improve the environment, but they've also spent generations creating that environment. And I think we should celebrate what they've achieved, and we should encourage them to do more. That's what SFI is designed to do, and that's what the scheme is delivering.
Mr Speaker, he doesn't know, does he? He doesn't know. They're spending large amounts of public money. They didn't set up a system to measure it. And the new Secretary of State, he's generally on the money. I'm sure he's asked this question, what are we getting for the money? So let me try a simpler version of the question. With elms so far, has there been environmental improvement, environmental degradation, or is it simply don't know?
Well, these things actually are quite easy to see and to measure. If you look at the amount of hedgerows planted in England over the last decade, there has been thousands of kilometres of hedgerows planted. There's large areas that are going into creating biodiversity, to creating food for wild bird populations. That's what SFI is delivering. It's there to see. All he needs to do is get out of Cambridgeshire and go and look at some of those farmers.
Dame Priti Patel.
Great, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So DEFRA officials met with King Seeds on the 19th of January. The department regularly meets a range of businesses. That includes a specific working group established with the Horticultural Trade Association, and this group met most recently on the 18th of January.
Mr
Speaker, the Minister will know that King Seeds is what's known as a well-established local business. They've been based in Kelvedon since 1888. They trade in horticultural seeds. They're known for their sweet peas. But he will be aware that they cannot send their products to Northern Ireland, and they are saying this is because of the barriers related to the Windsor framework. Can he clarify if the announcements earlier this week, and which will be discussed in the SIs later on today, will resolve this issue? If not, can he work with me and teams across government to make sure we deal with this issue? And perhaps he'd like to come to Kelvedon to meet the company as well.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And, of course, as I say, Deaf officials did meet with King Seeds on the 19th of January. I'm more than happy to meet with her and with them to discuss their concerns, to see how we can support them in all the excellent work they do locally in my honourable friend's constituency. So we appreciate the concerns of King Seeds. We're also inviting them to the new horticultural working group announced in yesterday's command paper with industry representatives, and the government will ask the group to address the movement of seeds to consumers in Northern Ireland as a priority, and I look forward to hearing its recommendation.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and apologies for my earlier misdemeanour. Can I ask the Minister if, now that we've got significant progress towards the restoration of devolution, would he agree to work with us on this side of the House and the other ministerial colleagues to ensure that issues like the horticultural one continue to be resolved so that we get maximum efficiency across the North Channel?
And of course, I'm delighted to work with the honourable gentleman. I think we have a track record of working with friends in the DUP to solve the challenges that we face. That conversation can continue going forward, and I look forward to working with him in the future to continue to solve the challenges we face.
David Simmons.
Number 9, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
This government has actually created a whole framework for restoring nature through our legally binding Environment Act targets, and that includes our world-leading commitment to halt the decline of species by 2030. And through our Environment Improvement Plan, we are accelerating action towards this. And it's a shame I wasn't asked just now, but we've restored an area the size of Dorset of wildlife habitats. We've got a network of marine protected areas. We've got 5 million trees planted last year. We've got 55 plus landscape.
Can I just say, this personal battle is the person up here who's asked the question. Let's not have it across the chamber. David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Right up Northern and Pinner is home to many sites that are incredibly important for biodiversity, as are many of our suburbs here in London. Does my right honourable friend agree that projects like the new Riverside Park, delivered by Harrow Council in partnership with the Hatch End Association, are really good examples of projects that support biodiversity in our suburbs?
Minister. I thank him for that, and he's a great champion for his local area, and he's absolutely right. We're working with a whole range of partners and local people to put nature at the heart of what we do, and I can't commend Harrow Council enough and the Hatch End Association for work that they are doing. I think they're putting in an apple orchard, wetlands, wildflower meadows. It's a superb addition to his already beautiful constituency.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Environmentalists, such as those at Chester Zoo, were shocked to see the government has ignored the advice of their own experts and authorised the use of neonicotinoid pesticides for the 4th year in a row. Could the Minister tell me how this is in line with our national and international obligations to reduce the overall risk from pesticides and how it reduces our biodiversity loss?
Well, she will know from reading all the details of this derogation that, in fact, it will only ever be used if it actually hits the criterion, and in many cases it never actually does.
Right, let us go to Sherwood.
Question number 10, Mr Speaker.
Excellent.
The Environmental Agency's budget this year is £1.96 billion, so just around £2 billion, an increase of over £700 million since 2015. But of course, we closely monitor that, both in terms of the quantum, but also how we ensure we get value for money from it.
Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for his response. Following the 2014 flooding, the current Foreign Secretary and then the Prime Minister stated that money was no object as he agreed to a £100 million plan to protect the Somerset levels. 10 years on, we're experiencing devastating floods with increased regularity. So I wanted to ask the Minister what steps he is taking to protect homes in Somerset from flooding and ensure floodwater is efficiently and effectively pumped away from farmland.
Well, she raises an extremely important point, because when there is flooding, it is absolutely devastating to homeowners, to businesses, and also to farmers. And that is why, in her part of the country, we set up the Somerset Rivers Authority Partnership. It's why we had targeted additional funding specifically for Somerset, an extra £80 million. And that targeted action is enabling the area to be more resilient. But, of course, there's further work to do.
Sir Charles Walker.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Severe winter storms drive many seabirds inland, but after a few days most leave. But not cormorants, Mr. Speaker. The number of cormorants roosting permanently inland has risen from 4,000 30 years ago to about 65,000 now, and they're having a huge impact on freshwater silverfish. Would the Minister of State meet with me and representatives of the Angling Trust, an organisation I used to chair, and other interested parties to discuss this issue?
Well, it's always a pleasure to meet with my right honourable friend, but he mentions the important issue of seabirds, and he will, I'm sure, have noticed the announcement yesterday of two major positive steps. First, the biggest campaign, the #1 issue of the RSPB for the last 25 years, Mr. Speaker, has been tightening up the overfishing of sand eels, and we're closing English waters to sand eels. That is hugely important to seabirds, particularly to the puffin. And secondly, we announced 30 marine designated areas. To put that in context for the House, that's an area equivalent to the size of Suffolk. A huge step forward in protecting seabirds, where the UK has a leading position globally.
Hopefully Emma Hardy will put us back on track. Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with farmer Henry Ward, who showed me the extensive and damaging flooding right across his farmland caused by 2 breaches in the river after the storm. The Environment Agency are unable to tell him when they will have the resources to repair these breaches. And what Henry told me is this means that not only has he lost all of the crop that was flooded, but he also will be unable to plant a new crop again in spring. And he's not the only farmer impacted. When will the government realise that their failure to be decisive and get ahead of the problem of weak defences is costing farmers their livelihoods and our country's food security?
No, I'm telling the... Sorry, Secretary. We only get till 10 o'clock. To take advantage is just not fair. There has got to be briefer questions from the front benches. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, not only is the Water Minister being decisive, he's actually met the individual minister, the individual farmer that she mentions on his farm. And we are taking action to look at how we better empower the internal drainage boards. And she shouldn't us from a sedentary position, Mr. Speaker. I actually represent, in the Fens, one of the areas where internal drainage boards are most important. I've worked with them for 14 years, and the ministerial team is working actively with them now.
On the Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are arrangements in place through to the end of 2025 supporting the continuity of the supply of veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland. We are clear that we must also ensure there is a long-term solution safeguarding those supplies on an ongoing basis, and will continue to engage with the EU on all aspects of the operation of the Windsor Framework.
Colin Lockhart.
I thank the Minister for his response. Continued restrictions to veterinary medicines remain a very real threat to local agriculture, and the BVA President is noted as saying that a serious risk posed to public health and animal welfare if a permanent solution to access to veterinary medicines in Northern Ireland is not found. Whilst the command paper signals a welcome focus and a working group to deal with this, can he confirm that this government will act unilaterally by spring if this issue is not resolved? Thank you.
Well, we'll continue to work with the EU to try and find a long-term solution to that. Of course, we have to find that solution. Those negotiations are ongoing, and I don't want to, from this dispatch box, preempt any of those discussions, but we do recognise we do need a long-term solution to solve this challenge.
It's a topical smart Menzies.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, since last update in the House, this government has been delivering on its plan to back British farmers, announcing an increase of, on average, 10% for our environmental farming payments, so farmers can protect our environment and continue to grow the food that we need. Recent storms have threatened the livelihoods of many farmers, which is why, alongside the wider flood recovery framework, I announced financial support of up to £25,000 for farmers who have suffered uninsurable damage to their land. And yesterday we had the 1-year anniversary of the Environmental Improvement Plan. I won't repeat the announcements that we touched on earlier, Mr. Speaker, giving your steer on brevity. But finally, it's worth reminding the House we have passed second reading of the Pet Abduction Bill, which introduces stricter sentences for those who steal dogs and cats. It causes huge trauma to families and to pets. We're taking decisive action to address those crimes.
Speaker, flooding has caused repeated damage to homes across rural Fylde. Last week I held a multi-agency meeting with Fylde's flood authorities, who updated me on the work carried out since their initial meeting last July. from blocked culverts to overflows from highways and apparently insufficient drainage on newly built estates. The causes are wide-ranging. And at the meeting's conclusion, I asked the agencies to provide a written breakdown of their action plan. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss the plan and how his department can assist?
Well, as my honourable friend knows, I'm very familiar with the file and the train and the issues there. I'm always happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss these issues and also just to update him. I am in contact with the Secretary of State for levelling up around new developments and some of the wider issues that I know he has been raising.
SNP spokesman Stephen Bonner.
Very much, Mr Speaker. The UK ended the year as the only rich nation with over 10% food price inflation, and still families face persistent price increases on their food shopping. Now Brexit red tape on European food imports poses further risk of rising inflation of prices such as bread, milk and even baby formula. So will the Secretary of State, I'll ask again, commit to implementing food price controls if further Brexit red tape leads to food price hikes that are being anticipated?
Yeah. Well, such is the obsession with Brexit within the SNP. There's no mention of Ukraine and the impact that the war has had. There's no mention of the strikes of farmers across the EU. There's no recognition of the huge amount of work that my right honourable friend, the Farming Minister, is doing in terms of supply chains. And he also seems not to have noticed either the rapid review that we are conducting on labelling, which is about empowering our consumers and ensuring that the high animal welfare standards we have in England are better reflected.
Mr Robert Goodman.
The Secretary of State has seen reports in Farmers Weekly that around a third of the UK wheat crop is either rotted in the ground because of wet conditions or it didn't get drilled at all. Supplies of spring seed is very tight, with many varieties already sold out. And whilst it is possible for some farmers to use farm-safe seed, it is illegal for that to be traded between farms, and indeed many farmers didn't grow spring crops this year or indeed sold their crops at harvest. Is there a solution to this problem?
Well, I'm very alive to this issue, both because of the very good work that Farmers Weekly has done to highlight it, but also my right honourable friend as chair of the Select Committee has also discussed it with me and with the Farming Minister. My right honourable friend, the Farming Minister, is in touch and discussing with plant breeders, and we need to look at what we can do constructively, working with them to pick up a very legitimate issue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The recent Office of Environmental Protection report found that the government is off track in hitting environmental targets, including restoring our waterways to health. What's the government going to do to get back on track?
Well, as was covered earlier, this was a report based on 2 months of data within a 25-year plan, so it was somewhat, shall we say, premature in its judgment. This is the first government in the world to put legally binding targets to reverse nature decline into law. We marked at Kew yesterday the one-year anniversary, setting out further proposals, which we've touched on already. And we've also provided international leadership, putting nature at the heart of tackling climate change at COP26, which was very much reflected at COP28.
Neale Hudson.
Our EFRA Select Committee has been consistently holding water companies and regulators to account for the inexcusable levels of sewage being illegally dumped into our precious waterways, but more can be done. Would my honourable friend agree that having introduced our plan for water, record levels of investment in monitoring and improving water quality, as well as unlimited fines for water companies, that while opposition parties have no affordable plan and just throw muck from the sidelines, it's this government that's actually getting on with and dealing with the issue?
Well, my honourable friend is right. We have a plan. A lot has been done, but he's also right. More can be done, and I can reassure the House I am absolutely committed to doing so. We will hold the water companies to account, and that is my absolute intention.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Springwater Park in my constituency suffers from regular flooding during storms, causing landslip and movement approaching the highway. Unfortunately, it falls outside of established funding pots like Belwyn, so we keep on getting bounced between Duluth and Defra. So will the Minister meet with me and Bury Council to see what we can do to actually address this problem?
Well, I'm aware that the government is investing on ongoing projects within his constituency, including Radcliffe and Redreave scheme. And of course, we are doubling the amount of investment that we're putting into flood alleviation schemes from 2.6 billion to 5.2 billion over the next 6-year funding round. But of course, I'm happy to meet with the honourable member.
Steve Tuckwell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Uxbridge and South Ruislip is home to many international food and drinks manufacturers, including General Mills and Coca-Cola, both of whom are looking to expand their operations here in the UK. Can my right honourable friend update the House on the work being done to support such manufacturers to expand and grow for the benefit of our local and national economies?
Of course, we have regular meetings with the food and drink sector to make sure that we are in tune with their concerns and their aspirations. Well, those discussions will continue. We'll continue to support great businesses like Coca-Cola and its constituency to support British jobs and to create benefit to the UK economy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Towns and villages like Malden and Shefford in my constituency have seen their flood risk profile change dramatically over the years, in part due to housing growth. How will the Minister make sure that funding for the Environment Agency and IDBs adequately reflects the way that this risk has evolved?
Improving our flood alleviation schemes on our flood resilience is incredibly important, which is why, as a government, we are recognising the amount of investment that we need to put into this, doubling that from £2.6 billion to £5.2 billion over the next 6-year period. And those sorts of schemes that we are helping will help projects across the country deal with those problems.
John Whittingdale.
My right honourable friend recognised that drift net fishing for bass is more sustainable, targeted and efficient than fishing with set nets. And will he consider looking at the ban, which was introduced as a temporary measure, to allow those with an existing bass entitlement to undertake drift net fishing?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Bass stocks are still recovering from poor spawning periods and overfishing. The Bass Fisheries Management Plan commits to review existing commercial access, including gear types such as drift nets, which pose a high risk to sensitive species in bass fisheries. But a careful balance must be struck between increasing fishing opportunities and protecting vulnerable bass stocks. But I can assure my right honourable friend that these matters will remain open.
Weston.
Speaker, since April last year, thousands of homes in my constituency have suffered from a fly infestation assumed to originate from a recycling plant. Will the Minister agree to meet with me and the Environment Agency to get this resolved?
I am more than happy to meet with the honourable member to try and deal with these issues, because this government will take waste and recycling incredibly important, and if that means the challenges are impacting householders, we need to get on top of that, and I'm happy to meet with him to discuss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Wallace Quarry in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle-under-Lyme, is stinking again, with monitoring stations showing high levels of hydrogen sulphide and complaints soaring. This site is blighting my constituents too, and the Environment Agency now say the owner is no longer working towards compliance. It's long past time that the permit was revoked and the company prosecuted. Will the Minister come to Staffordshire to witness the stink and see the sorry sight for himself?
When he's doing so, he can take the licence the way one at Cowdenbeath at Chorley.
Well, always listen closely, Mr Speaker, to your steer. She raises an extremely important issue. I know it is very troubling to those affected. My ministerial colleague is actually going there in the coming days, and I can assure her that this is being discussed and very actively followed up.
Tricia Gibson.
Mr Speaker, as food price inflation remains twice as high as general inflation in the UK, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit warns that food price inflation could rise even higher next year. What assessment has the Secretary of State made with his colleagues about the impact of soaring food prices on those we represent?
Well, of course, we continue to monitor food price inflation and do work with the sector to reduce that as much as possible. We cooperate with not only farmers, processors and retailers, but all of those involved in the sector to try and make sure that we provide for our constituents a reasonably priced food basket. The good news is that our food basket in the UK actually is lower than it is in many parts of the European Union.
Yeah, that completes question. Point of order. Sure. Point of order, Neale Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to question 1, the Secretary of State attributed another party's position on Europe to my party. The Alba party's position on Europe is EFTA, which maintains sovereignty over fisheries and farming. I would be grateful if the Secretary of State would correct the record.
Such is the confusion within the SNP. I hope the House forgives me for the mistake that I recognise he has changed his party and now is a member of Alba. I'm happy to correct the record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just would like your advice on the scheduling of business today. There's a number of people...
Sorry, it's not relevant to the questions that we've just had. The only way we can do that is to do it after we've done the questions. We're going to Attorney General now. OK, sorry about that.